Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And I'm excited to thank you for joining us for the third public event of the Institute's Global Competition Project. Today's event is focused on strategic communications, national level narratives, and the flow and deliberate shaping of information as it relates to our nation's ability to gain and maintain competitive advantage on the global stage. To that end, I submit that we are at an inflection point in human history when it comes to the proliferation of, access to, and manipulation of information at scale. Never has it been easier for a single person to communicate whatever they want with so many others, millions or even billions from virtually anywhere around the globe in such a short order, all in the length of the time it takes to craft a message and hit send. All you need is an internet connection and a smartphone, tablet, or computer. That's an incredibly powerful reality, one we are just starting to grapple with and try to understand at societal level, especially from a policy and technology perspective, but also from a human biology and psychological aspect. Evidence of that awakening can be found in the recent Facebook, I guess we're calling them Meta now, whistleblowing hearings, the manipulation of US elections by Russia, and in the examination of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, all of which have representative instances of competing narratives and the shaping of information to influence thought and action using widely available technology platforms. Our competitors across the globe are using thoughtful and deliberative narratives to drive their policy agendas and strategies. China, via its Belt and Road Initiative, is just one instance of how a competitor has demonstrated exceeding effectiveness at swaying minds and money, the core of power and influence with unprecedented reach, precision, and impact. So this begs the question, what is at risk in this reality for the United States? Our core institutions, our security and prosperity. How do we better understand the implications of our interconnected world so we can relay our nation's priorities with clear intent and ultimately assure our competitive advantage and effective deterrence without provocation? This is the reason we're here today, to examine these questions and more. But first, before we get into today's discussion, I'd like to offer the floor to our chairman, General Al Gray, for his introductory remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I just want to take this opportunity to welcome our very special guests, both virtual and here in person. We deeply appreciate you coming today and participating in this very important topic with us. And with that, let's get moving.
All right, sir. Thank you. And now I'd like to offer the floor to our CEO, Dr. Jen Buss, for a few remarks also.
Thanks, Ken. Just a couple of things from me. First, thank you all, and I'm going to commend Tim for getting yet another event off the ground on this topic. We came in to 2021 going to focus on two topics for the year, and that was really looking at global competition and economics and what that means for the United States, and understanding cognitive security disinformation campaigns. And today, as it's the 1st of December, right, we're 12 months into working on both of those topics. We're at this culminating point in at least those two topics in the discussion. So I'm really excited how this intersection plays for Potomac Institute in our initiatives this year, as well as from a science and technology policy perspective, right? All of the changes in technology have been tremendous that Tim mentioned, and the policy hasn't really been able to keep up as much. And that's okay, but we just want to be able to grapple with that and put our hands around it. So thank you all for coming and joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Buss. So before we do the introduction of the panels, the panel, a little bit about just the project that we're talking about, the Global Competition Project. So this, as Dr. Buss mentioned, this project was launched to explore what the United States must do to continue to thrive as a global leader, economically and otherwise, driving toward a societal level understanding and approach to competition at the intersection of policy, industry, and science and technology. To do so, the project is commissioning a spectrum of experts from diverse fields across the Potomac Institute's network. Their purpose is to highlight and elevate issues surrounding both the challenges and opportunities associated with societal level competition today and in the future. What are the greatest vulnerabilities to consider? What is at stake? How do we best leverage our strengths? Ultimately, the project's goal is to develop foundational references through research, discussion, events, and papers, et cetera, for national security professionals, policymakers, industry leaders, and others as they drive awareness and understanding and how the US might address the most consequential aspects of near-peer competition. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel today. Starting off at my left here, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Curtis Pearson, Vice President here at the Potomac Institute. He joined the Institute following 30 years with Northrop Grumman, where he served in a variety of roles in program and systems development, spanning a wide range of DoD and intel community technology, missions, and systems. Curtis is a retired Navy commander, having served 27 years both on active duty and in the reserve, with expertise in mine and amphibious warfare, ship systems engineering and construction, and port operations. He also previously served as chairman of the board for the Southern Coalition for Advanced Transportation. Curtis is going to facilitate our discussion today on strategic communication and information in the global competitive environment. And he's joined by an extraordinarily distinguished panel who I'm also pleased to introduce. Starting with right across from me is Mr. Jeff Skunk Baxter, a member of our Board of Regents here at the Potomac Institute. So we're glad to have him. He's got over 4 decades of experience as an expert on missile defense and counterterrorism. Additionally, which is really cool, he has earned 8 platinum records in his music career as a world-renowned guitarist and former member of both Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers. Skunk served as chairman of the Civilian Advisory Board for Ballistic Missile Defense, and he's advised members of Congress on the House Science Committee and participated in numerous war games for the Pentagon over the years. He's also consulted for government organizations to include NGIA, the Missile Defense Agency, as well as for defense contractors, and was invited to serve on the Laser Advisory Board at Lawrence Livermore National Labs, the NASA Exploration Systems Advisory Committee, and he's lectured at the University of Manitoba School of Political Science. Thank you for being here, sir. So we have also joining us virtually is Dr. Rand Waltzman, also one of the newest members of the Board of Regents here at the Potomac Institute, and he's an adjunct senior information scientist at RAND Corporation. Dr. Waltzman has 40 years of experience performing and managing research in artificial intelligence, applied to domains including social media, cognitive security in the information environment. Prior to RAND, Dr. Waltzman was acting chief technology officer of the Software Engineering Institute in Washington, D.C. of Carnegie Mellon University. He also served as the Information Innovation Office at DARPA, was chief scientist for the Applied Sciences Laboratory at Lockheed Martin, a professor at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, and held research positions at University of Maryland and the Applied Physics Lab of the University of Washington. Thank you, sir, for being with us today. Moving across the table again, I have Ms. Jody Moxham. She's founder of Phase One Communications and a strategic advisor with decades of experience in large-scale strategic communications and professional training. Throughout her career, she's helped multinational corporations measurably strengthen the persuasiveness of their global marketing strategies and communications. Jody developed a methodology that reliably forecasts the persuasiveness of communication as measured by the metrics marketers rely upon. She founded Phase One Communications, which trained analysts to use that methodology with statistically reliable results. So after 9/11, at the request of the United States government, Phase One actually adapted that methodology for national security interests and introduce best private sector practices and understanding global audiences and what motivates them. Very applicable to our discussion today, absolutely. Since a successful sale of her company, Jody works on challenges that intrigue her, which includes tackling tough communications and marketing problems, and finding truly unique solutions that produce measurable results. So we're very happy to have you with us today. Across from me also, we have Dr. Alex Baca, the Corporate Director for Strategy at Northrop Grumman, where he assesses and challenges the competitive strategy of the company's businesses and programs. He also develops options to achieve corporate goals, communicates strategic issues to senior business and technical leadership, and manages the corporate-wide internet strategy blog. He has nearly 18 years of experience at Northrop and specializes in strategy, mergers and acquisitions, financial planning, modeling and forecasting, and technology corporate development. Dr. Baca also previously consulted for top defense education organizations such as the Defense Acquisitions University, DAU, and the Industrial College of the Armed Forces over at National Defense University here in DC. So with this distinguished panel, Curtis is going to start off by providing a deeper introduction of the issue and a framework for our discussion that will ultimately be captured along with highlights from today's event in a paper, one paper in a series to be produced by the project. So the goal is ultimately for those papers, along with the substance of today's event, to be drawn upon, as I mentioned earlier, as a reference for policymakers, industry leaders, and others, and how the country might address the most consequential aspects of societal level competition in the future. So with that, I'll be quiet and hand it over to Curtis after a lot of time.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you to our panelists for being here, and thank you to those who have joined us online. This is an extremely important topic, and one that is should have been dealt with much longer ago than it is. So as I think we'll talk about. I just have a few opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to the people who really know what they're talking about. On November 2nd, Peng Shuai, arguably the most recognizable sports star in the People's Republic of China, with over 500,000 followers on Chinese social media, posted a 1,600-word accusation of sexual assault against a former Communist Party vice president. She was not seen in public again until a very brief and very curated event in Beijing on November 20th. Her post was immediately deleted. Internet searches of her name were blocked in China. An oddly worded recant purported to be written by Peng was posted to US Twitter by the official Chinese news agency the very next day. The US response was to issue a statement asking where she was almost 2 weeks after she disappeared. 3 weeks after her disappearance, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, posted a still of a video call between Peng and an IOC official who declared that Peng seemed healthy and not under any restraint. The IOC will not release the video. Chinese media is accusing the West of racism for even asking about her welfare. A large number of Twitter bots immediately showed up with 0 followers that are continually retweeting the Chinese official news agency statements. At the same time, China is painting the US as an aggressor and an unwelcome presence in their territorial waters because of US warships transiting the Taiwan Straits, even though such transits are completely in keeping with international law. China is not the only area of concern. Russia is continuing to develop and plans to deploy in Europe the SSC-8 intermediate range nuclear capable cruise missile in open and complete contravention of the 1987 INF Treaty. Our European allies are worried, not just about the Russians' actions, but the lack of a clear and consistent US response. My point in bringing up these events is to point out that the global environment and the US competitive position in that environment is becoming increasingly complex, and our lack of a national strategic narrative for how and what we communicate in that space will continue to hamper our competitive position. confusing both our adversaries and our allies. Look at the Peng Shui incident. The Communist Party's strategic message is pretty clear. It does not matter how famous you are, challenge the party line, and you will disappear. And not only will the world bodies that you have made millions for, in this case, the IOC and the World Tennis Association, not come to your aid, they will enable our behavior to curry favor. The US response has varied from fairly weak in the Peng case to a somewhat stronger in the Taiwan Straits issue. The troubling thing to me is we don't seem to have a clear plan or strategy for when we will do what, how we will communicate our positions and our intent, and how we will ensure that our intent is made clear, passing through the cultural and political filters of our audience. This causes our allies and our adversaries to lack trust in our nation. This is not an issue from the current administration or the previous one, or even the one before that. The lack of a strategic narrative and a plan for communications goes back decades. I do not believe there's an easy solution, but we must have one. This is a complex issue. The complexity of the situation is increased by the fact that a number of these countries are both adversary and partner. Again, for example, China. The US and Chinese economies are inextricably linked and intertwined in ways that will never be severed, and we really would not want to even if we could. China, therefore, needs to understand where we will work together to support our common goals and where we will block their attempts to control the world's response to their aggressive actions and their play to be the regional hegemon. This is a wide-ranging and a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. I suspect this will not be the last discussion we have on this topic. We have 4 exceptional panels with us today, and I've asked them to look at this and address strategic communications from their areas of expertise about things like the need for a national level narrative and messaging strategy. What should that narrative be? How it can be an effective tool for US competition on the global stage. Why haven't we done this? How can we assure that our adversaries and allies can trust our message and consider them reliable? How do we ensure that the narrative is consistent across administration changes? How do we ensure that the message is developed and delivered in ways that will translate through the political, cultural, and language filters that they will pass through? Or, for that matter, anything else they think is important for the discussion. With that, I will turn it over to our first panelist, John Baxter.
Well, I'm hoping that everybody's had the opportunity to watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, to see the admission by Facebook and other social media companies about the fact that they know that what they created is highly addictive, damaging to especially young children, and completely across the board. It's the combination of the medium of social media and the fact that there are physical as well as psychological effects. We're all drug addicts. We are all addicted to the neurotransmitters that our brains create. As a musician, I understand that from a very visceral point of view, being able to manipulate people's emotions. I've done a million movie soundtracks. I know I could sit here with a guitar and in 20 seconds move you through every human emotion, from fear to sadness to anger to ecstasy. And it's all because I understand how to stimulate your brain to secrete the proper chemicals. The other problem that we have is because the whole concept of social media is so addictive, especially to the young folks in all over the world, but especially to the young folks in America, we have a drug addiction problem. And one of the things that's really frightening is there's one country that manufactures a syringe to inject those chemicals. Most of the the devices that are used to connect people up in social media are manufactured in China. Now, not only are these articles manufactured in China, but there has been a tremendous amount of evidence that things that are manufactured in China have embedded software and hardware in their systems already. We are at war. The Standing Committee of the CCCP in China about 7 years ago, for all intents and purposes, declared war on the United States. It's interesting. It looks like we're seeing what happened in the 1820s and 1830s. It's the Opium Wars turned the other way around. Yes, our adversaries are heavily involved in real drugs, et cetera, but the ability to, as the Shadow said, to bend men's minds is now firmly a part of a social, operational, military, and fully all cardinal points push by both China and Russia. The concept of perception management, perception engineering is much more well understood, frankly, by our adversaries than it is by us. So I'm a little bit scared to death here because as I wear a syringe, an electronic syringe on my belt, I wear two of them. I carry them with me constantly. I am even though I have a desire not to use them, I'm forced to in many cases because our society has adapted these tools as de rigueur as part of how we operate in our social fabrics. We are witnessing the operationalization of perception management. Now, it's not the first time. The Brits did a brilliant job during World War II. Everything from the fake Third Army that General Patton headed up before the invasion of France and D-Day, the brilliant work done around the Suez and the Mediterranean by the Brits. I had an opportunity at one time to have dinner with Mr. Oleg Kalugin, who is was the deputy director of the KGB and has a consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. And after a couple of drinks, Oleg was certainly open about what they did. I said, sir, with all due respect, I am absolutely in awe of what Russia did in Europe in the 1960s in the anti-nuclear campaign. It's brilliant. Tell me how to tell a lie. I said, it's real simple, Skunk. You just take the truth and you wrap it in bull crap. And you make sure that the crap gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but inside that core is a core of truth. They have operationalized strategic messaging to the point where it has now affected our country, as Curtis had explained very well what our adversaries are doing. We're walking around in a fog because we still think that because of the Western concept of free will, that we actually make all our own decisions. And that is absolutely not true. We think we are, but we are influenced by so much. It's like going outside in the cold and trying to carry on a conversation when you're shivering so bad that you can barely control your body. The influence of this is so strong. So I'm glad we're here today. I think we're way behind the curve. The good news is I'm involved in a number of war games, and strategic messaging has now become a part of that war gaming. The operationalization of it, the application of it, the using it as a part of a focused operational plan is now beginning to gather some momentum. And I'm really hoping that the product that comes out of this forum is transmitted to the people on the Hill, and then somehow or other is transmitted to other policymakers and other influencers, including the general population. I spent 40 years in the music business. Good news is they got a lot of platinum albums, a lot of gold albums, got inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's not important. The only reason I bring that up is that somebody has recognized that I have the ability to communicate. What kind of communication do we have coming out of Hollywood? Last time I watched television, I saw Robert Senna, I'm trying to think of the actor's name, on his knees apologizing to the Chinese government for saying something about Taiwan. Something's really wrong here. Really, really wrong. So it's time that we educate our population and our government officials to the fact that they are already being influenced and they need to be inoculated against the syringe and the heroin that is being generated by our adversaries. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Skunk.
Appreciate it so well. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, I hope you
Yes, sir. So, with that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Rand Waltzman. Rand.
Well, so I'm really kind of interested at the moment, mostly in sort of looking ahead to the future. And the future is developing very rapidly. So the environment, the information environment, the social media environment is about to change pretty radically as virtual reality starts to really take hold on a large scale. So you can see Facebook has changed their name to Meta, right? Reflecting their interest in the Metaverse, which is an old term that comes from a novel. It was from, I don't know, from 1992, the term was first introduced in a novel, but the idea has been around a long time. I mean, Second Life has been around for quite some time, this concept of virtual reality environments. But the difference is today, I think the hardware and the software started to catch up to where we can actually do these things in a much more interesting way. And when you see companies like Facebook and Microsoft ready to put really big bucks into it, then I think we can be pretty confident that it will happen. Now, once that happens, the name of the game really going to change significantly, because the opportunities to do manipulation of people and to do the types of things that Skunk was talking about they will go to a completely different level. I mean, in a way which we simply haven't seen before. I mean, just to give you a simple example, there's some politicians, which is one of my favorite examples. So, there's some politicians, people say, well, when they talk to a crowd, they have the ability to make everybody in the audience think that they're talking just to them. Well, guess what? In this environment, if you go to a political rally, you're surrounded by thousands of people, perhaps, and maybe millions all over the world, and you have somebody making a speech. It is actually technically pretty straightforward to make it so that the guy is, in fact, talking to you personally. I mean, in such a way that every single person could be hearing something different without realizing it. So you have a chance to combine interpersonal dynamics, one-on-one dynamics, with group dynamics in a way which was simply never possible. You could never do those things simultaneously. And with this kind of environment, you can. And that's just one simple example. So, if people think things are bad now, well, things are about to get an awful lot worse. And, the US government hasn't even begun to catch up to things the way they are now. So that leaves them like basically nowhere when it comes to what's happening next. And well, I don't see that changing anytime soon. I mean, in order to address these problems, what needs are fundamental attitude adjustments by the authorities, really fundamental. Our competitors, they have the right types of attitude towards these things. I mean, you look at the Russians, their experience in this field goes way back. I mean, think about, for example, one of the greatest pieces of propaganda and disinformation of the 20th century was something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of my favorites. I mean, this thing was released in 1902, and it was not the KGB. It was the KGB's forerunner. It was the Okhrana, which was the Tsarist secret police, who were also masters of disinformation techniques. I mean, one of their operators in Paris, this guy, he was doing spectacular work. And this piece of crap that was released in 1902 is still out there in circulation today, over 100 years later. I mean, now that's, that was cleverly done. So anyway, while we haven't dealt with it as, things as they are, like I say, things are about to get a lot, and we need to start paying more serious attention to it. So I think I'll stop there and let everybody else have a say.
Man, appreciate it. Turn it over to Jody Miles.
Okay, I think I have, tying on to what both of you have been talking about, what I want to start addressing is what is the solution? How do we develop strategic messaging that is effective, that is mind-changing? And I've watched people turn themselves into knots trying to define what strategic messaging is. So that's where I want to start. What strategic messaging is, what separates it from all other forms of communication and messaging is it's designed to produce a strategic outcome. Now, what are some of those strategic outcomes? Skunk hit one of them, bend people's mind. Gain adoption of new ideas, establish norms and behaviors that you want people to or other nations to adhere to. Control the narrative around a subject, be the initiator of the narrative and control the direction that it goes. Manage perceptions, motivate desired behaviors. Those are the kind of objectives that strategic messaging has achieved before and can achieve for the future that Rand is talking about. Now, just for the point of comparison to other forms of communication, entertainment, the purpose is to entertain. The elements that they use are characters, story, narrative, music, visuals. You can harness all of those elements for a strategic purpose. And then it's no longer, it uses entertainment elements, but it's no longer, its purpose is no longer to just entertain. Its purpose is to manage perceptions, provide role models, provide behavioral models for people to act on. Education, purpose is to teach. All of those elements that go into teaching can also be applied to achieving a strategic outcome. Same with alerts and directions, awareness and information. All of those forms of communication can be harnessed to serve a strategic outcome. Strategic messaging is new to the government, new to national security interests. Both of you, everybody so far has established how bad we are at it, but it's because we haven't adopted it. But the commercial world, the marketing world, has adopted it and has been using it for the better part of a century. And we're very good at it. We may be the best in the world at doing it. There are differences and similarities, so we need to address those differences so that we can get them out of the way. National security has much higher stakes. The commercial world, marketing is to produce sales. Very different outcomes. We have a much harder challenge to overcome than simply sales. We have less data to work with. Marketers typically spend anywhere from 7 million up to hundreds of millions of dollars to understand their target audience and understand the environment that they're going to be working in. So we have less data, far less data to work with. We also need to produce very different results. Our results are never sales. Our results are things that influence or that affect quality of life and even life itself. Another difference is we have no common measures. Because marketers use sales, they have a very easy job measuring sales. Easy, sort of. We'll get to that in a minute. When we look at the similarities are what gets exciting and gets to the point where we can really apply some of the learning out of the commercial world to national security. Success in both arenas. Success relies on motivating the target audience to think and to behave in a particular way. The ways are different, but we need to motivate people to act the way that we want them to act. The tools are the same. The tools are the message, the messenger, and the channel. And it's more complicated than that. I recognize boiling that down, but it's boiling it down to the essentials. Also, the principles are the same. The principles that underlie persuasion, the principles that underlie causing an audience to identify with characters or to read themselves into a story, those principles are the same. Managing perceptions, how we teach, all of those fundamental principles are the same. So we have a lot that we can learn from marketers. I'm going to boil it down to two areas: how to measure and how to develop a process that leads to successful mind-bending strategic messaging. So on the measurement side, like I said, sales is relatively easy to measure. However, it takes 12 to 18 months in order to determine whether the sales indicate a success or a failure. By the 1960s, marketers couldn't wait that long. The opportunity loss was so great that they had to shorten that time. They shortened it down to months, now down to weeks, and in some cases, even days. The way that they've been able to do that is they found surrogate measures for sales. So they identified that there are specific measures like engagement. Is it going to break through? Is it going to capture the attention of the target audience? Is it going to be remembered? And if it's remembered, how long will it be remembered? A day, a week? That will tell them how often they need to reinforce a message in order to keep their message top of mind in those people they need it to be top of mind. Persuasion. How do you, persuasion indicates whether you have successfully changed behavior or not. That is a measure now that marketers are able to do within about a week to 10 days. Other measures are likability, attention, loyalty, etc. And those measures, they may not work for us as surrogate measures, but remember the principle. Marketers found what they want to accomplish, which was sales, and they found surrogate measures that would indicate when they have achieved that. That's the principle that we can take forward into the national security arena. Now, I mentioned process. One of the things that marketers learned was that when you follow a process, you increase the likelihood dramatically of being able to achieve those measures. Nestle is the #1 food company in the world. They have more than 2,000 brands that's being sold in 186 countries. So that's marketing on 2,000 brands in 186 different cultures, languages, environments, etc. Every single one of them, I follow the same process as we follow here in the US, so they follow in Uganda, so they follow in Russia. The process is the same. So you think, okay, well, that's Nestle. Take a look at General Motors, very different type of corporation. Nestle products you probably buy once a week or every couple of weeks. General Motors, 4 to 10 years sales cycle. General Motors has 4 brands, but they've got 60 some models and they're sold in more than 140 countries. They follow the same process, regardless of who it is that they are marketing to, what country they're in, what model. Cadillac, GMC, the same process is applied. And what's interesting, after we started working with these companies and others, is that not only were the same processes within each of these corporations, these multinational corporations, when you take away the things that are unique to a brand and a category, the process is identical. And it is the same process that was developed for ExxonMobil, Coca-Cola, Campbell Soup Company, Gillette, SC Johnson, Johnson & Johnson, on and on. We saw this process demonstrated across the board. So when you have different entities, so many different entities putting so much research and revenue against finding solutions, when you have them all arriving at the same conclusion, and this is over decades, you know you can rely on this process as being true. It is proven. So the process, and I'll just do the top line on this. I don't want to get too deep in it, otherwise there's just too much time here. There are 4 stages: plan, develop, execute, measure, and evaluate. The plan stage is probably the most important, the most time consuming, the least understood, and the one that we never do. It takes too much time, it takes too much work, and we want to jump into develop it. Here's what we should do, and gung-ho. It's like the John Boyd's OODA loop. It's a cycle of continuous improvement. After you go through the final stage of of measure and evaluate, then if you're getting the results that you want, you keep going forward. If you're not getting the results you want, you look back into your plan stage, reinvestigate the assumptions that you've made or other research or other things that you based your decisions on, and you start fine tuning and adjust. So you go through that cycle. Marketers go through that cycle constantly. They call it the SCDC, the Strategic Communication Development Cycle. And I can't stop this portion, and I hope we can get to more solutions and things like that in the discussion, but I can't end this without offering up a cautionary tale. And it was one that we were on the periphery of. It was back during the Bush administration, not too long after 9/11, when there was a desire to build a bridge between the American people and the Muslim people. And a campaign was envisioned called Shared Values. One of the best advertising people in the country, a woman named Charlotte Beers, was brought in to run the campaign for the Bush administration. They followed the SCDC, they did the research, they developed a campaign that would achieve the objective that they had set. But then they had to go through the approvals, and each approver had the right to change or to request changes. Each sign off cost something to the campaign. So instead, at the end, after all the changes had been made, instead of having a campaign that built a bridge between American people and Muslim people, we had a campaign that was targeted to American people saying, ain't we great? Didn't we do good? Isn't this a great place to be? And the result of that being released in the Middle East, the King of Jordan, our ally, refused to air it in his country because he said it would be too inflammatory. The countries that did air it got negative feedback, and it actually ended up being fodder for the terrorist messaging at that time. So that's what happens if you don't follow the SCDC. You can fall off the cliff real fast, real easy. Okay, I think I'll stop there and we can talk more on other things.
Thank you, Judy. And last up, Dr. Alex Baca. Alex, and I would like to mention for Alex that his views, the views he expresses today, are his own.
Thank you, Curtis. That makes the discussion more fun. I also I'm struck by this topic because it's really easy to say everything's changed, and it's really easy to say we're in a totally new world. But I also wanted to go back to the turn of the century, and not the turn of the century 20 years ago, but the turn of the century 120 years ago. But I was actually going to go back to Imperial Russia for exactly the same reason that Rand did, and discuss the protocols of the Elders of Zion and a bunch of other things too, because Russia realizes that they are way behind Great Britain in terms of building commerce, building allies, and getting diplomacy together. They're way behind Germany in industrialization, and they're trying to catch up, but they need another way to go off and build power on the world stage. They had been humiliated by Japan. They had discovered that the Ottoman Turks were much of a match for the Russian army. And in order to do this, they come up with a lot of the concepts that we now think about in information warfare. They developed a school of maskirovka, actually using the term maskirovka, which is inadequately translated as deception in English, but it's actually far more subtle than that. because in the original Russian, it's really about feeding the misperceptions in the adversary that are helpful to your own views. So you're not so much deceiving on what you're going to do, but you're actually helping the adversary think about things which are helpful to you. In some ways, what you would eventually end up doing is you turn the adversary's intelligence operations into actually assets for your own disinformation campaign. Very subtly and very sophisticated things. And they were doing this at the turn of the century. They were thinking about it, talking about it. And the other term that we now know is reflexive control showed up then as well, except that the trouble with reflexive control is everybody focuses on the control aspect of reflexive control and forgets the reflexive part of it. Reflexive control was really about understanding how your adversary thinks. In order to understand how your adversary thinks, you have to truly have a sophisticated understanding of your adversary from a dispositional, psychological point of view on what matters to them, what cause and effect relationships they believe are in operation, and how they think the world works. If you can understand your adversary better than anyone else, then you can go out and manipulate the information environment in such a way that your adversary thinks they're making their own choices, but they're making choices that are favorable to you. Just like Maskirovka, it's about playing on through us understanding what the adversary thinks, it's about playing on that understanding to turn them to your own views. You could think of it as the magician's force. You make them pick the card that you want them to pick so that the trick ends up working, except here the stakes are a lot more than the trick. And that's where I wanted to talk about where things start to change from 120 years ago. It was really hard to understand what other societies were like at that time. You might have a few people who studied abroad. You might have a few folks who married and lived abroad in capital cities, but by and large, other countries are mysteries to one another. That has completely changed. The United States, at least, is not a mystery to anybody. As strange as we may be to some observers, we do a very good job of putting all of our deliberations, all of our thoughts out in public for anybody to go off and look at. If you want to see how ideas propagate in the United States, just go back and rebuild Twitter feeds. You can actually follow ideas from various influencers to others. They can be fashion ideas, they can be political ideas. It's the same technique to go off and look at how they propagated through society, where they got picked up, what other social medias got on, and that's there for anybody who wants to go off and look at it and study it. So that's one big change. We've now made it very easy for others to understand how we work. I would argue we've probably put less effort into understanding how they work. I can think of two people, Alice Baca Johnston and Taiming Chen, who really put a lot of emphasis into understanding how the Chinese think. We systematically dismantled how our efforts to understand how Russians think after the Cold War, and we haven't bothered rebuilding those. And it takes time to develop that level of understanding. Another couple of things, four other things that have changed. The ability to target information operations is very, very different now. You heard earlier about modern advertising. You can now go off and micro-target individual groups, individual demographics, individual locations, and have a message that is geared directly towards them in any way you want to do. And you can put these messages together in a truly sort of almost combined arms way, where you have different messages all pushing you in the same direction, or sometimes in the opposite direction if you want to go off and do that, micro-targeted and deliberately timed. And that's the second part, this timing. Instead of going off and having the Tsarist forgers put together the protocols of the elders of Zion and then try to get it off into the European body politique, you can now go off and reach the world in a matter of moments if you would like to do that. Or you can parcel it over time. You can let ideas slow roll. You can have operations that play out over months where you put some stuff out there, it doesn't get a lot of notice, and then you go off and build on it and point back to it. Much as you saw, actually, it was Blair Witch Project was built up that way, where they planted discussions of Blair Witch as if it were a real myth, and then 6 months later, when the movie was released, they pointed back to the myth and said, "See, look, there's stuff out there actually on the Blair Witch." That was an information operation. There's a level of transience as well. You don't have to fool everybody all the time. You only have to fool a few people for a very short amount of time to get the policy outcome you would like, at which point it's then too late for anybody to do anything like that. And then finally, there's a level of transparency that is completely changed. There are no more secret cables. There are no more secret codicils to treaties. When you speak, you are speaking to allies, you are speaking to adversaries, you are speaking to your voters, you are speaking to undecided voters. All those messages can be read by everybody else. So while you may try and target your messages to reach certain people, everything you write and say will, you have to believe, be picked up and read by others who may not necessarily bring the same views and interpretation that your targeted audience is going to bring to them. So how do you go off and communicate in secret when you can't do this? So if we have all of these changes, the one other thing that I wanted to add to it is the notion of objectives. And that's that we tend to think in terms of goodies and baddies and deliberate objectives. So you're trying to prioritize one candidate over another candidate. You're trying to help one side over another side. But in many cases, the information campaigns may be a little bit more sophisticated than that. And here, while I started in Imperial Russia, I'd like to end in sort of prehistorical Greece. When Eris rolled the golden apple into Thetis's wedding because she left off the guest list, it was a golden apple that said "to the fairest," and she rolled it into the wedding not because she wanted Venus to go off and win the title of the fairest goddess. She rolled it off because she wanted to see Venus, Athena, and Hera fight with each other over who was actually the fairest. And in the process of doing that fighting, which split the Olympians, you also destroyed the city of Troy and decimated the Achaeans. You basically altered civilization. And that was what she wanted to accomplish. So when we think about what some of the information operations are trying to do, it may be a mistake to think it's about prioritizing one outcome over another. It may very well be all they want to do is sow discord. And you can think about what other golden apples have been rolled into the American body politic and what has happened in terms of the discussions and debates over who actually is the fairest and what these apples mean. And that may be enough to make other adversaries sit back and laugh and let us go off and destroy ourselves, much like the Greeks and the Achaeans did. So I think with that, happy to open it up for questions.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for your comments. And now we will go into questions. And we'll be taking some questions off of the chat feed on there. But I've asked Catherine Chapman, who's here with us today, who's an expert in information and strategic information and strategic messaging, to ask the first question.
Yeah, so I'm sitting back and kind of going back to where Tim started us off, that we're at this inflection point with volume technology access, and Curtis, your example kind of built on that. And I love that specific example, because you have this kind of scenario where you have a message out there, and then kind of the thought process around how do we remove this message almost is, well, let's delete one message and amplify another. And it's almost as if like, well, if we pull these levers and get all the levers just right, what we want people to believe will kind of persist and shift attitudes and behaviors in our favor. And then when we're talking about planning and process behind that, we think about how do we construct that from our point of view. So I'd like to kind of open up to ask folks here, we're viewing strategic communication as an answer to a lot of the problems we're having on the strategy side, but where are the limitations there? What are the things that we cannot rely on it for, or where does it not work best? What are times where other activities are better, and where do you think we should kind of bound this? Because in hearing all of you talk, this is the answer to everything. And maybe it plays a role in many ways, but I'm curious to hear, where have you come up to blockers, where are some of the limitations as well?
Okay.
You're closest. Sorry.
You're closest to the
Okay.
question.
Well,
So that's
I'll
easy
start
again.
it out. From my perspective, strategic messaging is best used when you are at a stage where you can still have influence. If you are beyond the stage of having influence, then it can be a part of it to prevent misunderstanding and prevent mistakes that are based on misreading the adversary. Because if you're beyond the point of being able to influence it, George Kennan said, if you don't like the outcome, change the circumstances that produce the outcome. So if strategic messaging can play a role in changing the conditions that produce the outcome, but there's policy that has to go in there. There's a whole different level of planning that needs to go along with that. But strategic messaging has a role. I'm trying to think there are other limitations. If we get to the point where we're at a conflict stage, then it seems like the strategic messaging is more with our allies, the more internal messaging to make sure that we're on the same page. Because at that point, and I'm not saying that China is an adversary. I'm not ready to use that word yet. In certain situations, it is. But we're not going to be able to change them. We might be able to influence some of their actions based on reprisals or based on what we convey that we might do in the event that something were to happen. Same situation is now with Russia and the Ukraine, China and Taiwan. There are multiple opportunities right now for us to do strategic messaging in conjunction with policy. Strategic messaging by itself will not do the job, but conveying the policy in a mind-bending way can be very helpful. That's anybody.
Yes, I would actually like to add something to that. So I would say that the biggest limitations at this point are, first of all, if you're going to communicate, you have to decide what it is you're going to say. You have to have something to say, right? So our number one problem is deciding what it is we would like to say. And then number two is, okay, are you willing to do what it takes to actually say it? So, everything else is kind of, we can talk about methods and techniques. I mean, yes, I agree. We're probably, we have some of the greatest techniques here in the world. I mean, for example, why do you think a lot of foreign elements are actually hiring our people, right? I mean, we have plenty of so-called public relations firms in the United States, which work for all sorts of people all over the world. So they're coming to hire our guys because we know we're very good. But still, gotta decide what you want to say. I mean, somebody introduced me one time to somebody. Said, look, this guy, he speaks 8 languages. And the other guy said, yeah, but does he have anything to say? So where we are is right now, we're not in a position where we can decide what to say. And we certainly don't have any willpower to say it. I mean, so those are the two big first problems to overcome. Techniques we're drowning in techniques. Forget that.
So can I ask a follow-up question that came across online from Dr. Mike Fritzy, who's also one of vice presidents here. And to your point about what we want to say and actually say it. So who in the U.S. government, he asked, is or should be responsible for strategic communications messaging? Who crafts that? I mean, who's driving what we want to say?
Well, right now there's nobody. There is nobody at the moment.
Really.
So who should it be?
There should be a czar.
Or should there even be somebody?
Yeah, there should be, because like we have a chief of staff of the Air Force, we have a national security advisor, we have someone who heads up the Treasury. Each person has a specific focus and capability. I'm just going to step back for a second on something that Jody had said. Part of the thing about communications is right now we're still in the mindset of developing weapons of mass instruction. I can't think of another word for it. It's like nuclear weapons. You figure, okay, well, the best way to do it is just kill everything. I'm going to refer to my mentor and former parole officer, General Al Gray, who, and there are no ex-Marines, there are only former Marines. And General Gray understands very specifically the Marine concept of the rifleman: one bullet, one target. It's very different from dropping a nuclear weapon. One bullet, one target. When the Chinese exfiltrated all the information from Equifax and also all the information from the Office of OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, the Chinese can now one bullet, one target. They understand that Mr. X and Mrs. Y's daughter was in therapy for a specific traumatic event at a particular age, at a particular time. They can now structure and form the message to a specific person. Now, in terms of marketing for the most part tries to identify groups of people who may be interested in a product or an idea. We're now to the point, our adversaries are now to the point where they can target individuals. And again, this syringe allows a country like China to target you and everyone else personally, specifically. What does that mean? That means that not only can you target people specifically, but you can target specific influencers. Now, this to me is an incredible opportunity. Xi Jinping has a cell phone. Vladimir Putin has a cell phone. The Ayatollah has a cell phone. They all have the syringe, but we are not developing the capability to target the specifics of the leadership. This is where I think we need to really focus and understand, and whoever is in charge of this eventually needs to understand across the spectrum. Again, from an I just coined the word, I don't know if somebody can come up with something better than a weapon of mass instruction, but to not only look at it from a mass point of view, but the individual targeting. And you combine all the data that was exfilled from Equifax with the data from OPM, you combine that with an AI machine and an understanding of your adversary's theology, if you want to put it, philosophy, it's frightening. And we are not doing that. And I hope one of the things that comes out of this is that when a concept, an idea, and a way forward comes out of here, good thing I mentioned it to a few folks before, Potomac Institute has a unique position in its ability to instruct and inform Congress about certain things. This will not happen unless somewhere somebody in some form of leadership says that there has to be a person to do this. Either whether it's legislated, whatever it is, that somebody says that this now has to be done and you are the person to do it. The biggest problem that I've seen, and I love my fellow man, I'm a musician, I'm an optimist, but more and more and more I see people who are designated to do a certain mission that are totally clueless. And so maybe what our first mission is to educate enough of the leadership so that one or two of those people can rise up out of that informed and capable. That's trying to answer that question. So.
Micro-targeting is something that the commercial world does on a daily basis. We can micro-target down to 3 people on a block with certain behaviors that you want to influence or reinforce. I want to something else. What the question that came in there is, where should this reside? In corporations, there is the marketing department is. What corporations do is they set the strategy for the corporation, the communication strategy. It is different from the national security strategy. It is different from the strategies that right now are being set for this country. Without having a communication strategy, and Rand, to your point, what do we talk about? What do we say? Without having that strategy, then each individual unit is have to come up with something on their own, self-generate, and it's not consistent with other messages that we're presenting. So it's contributing to the problem, that absence of having a communication strategy that then is implemented in, with Nestle 2,000 brands, every country, 186 countries. Each one of them is working against the corporate strategy and applying it in a way that fits their culture, their country, their language. Or with micro-targeting, taking that strategy and applying it to these 3 people. In the commercial world, we actually worked on a national campaign that had 5 targets, 5 individuals who made the decisions for the purchasing of this particular product across the nation. So it was a national campaign on national media targeting 5 people. So that's kind of getting to what you're talking about, various methods for how do you reach, how do you influence those individuals that have the greatest influence? And there are ways to do it, but it depends on what your objective is and what your national strategy is.
Well, Jody, I posit
Hmm.
that the United States does have a national strategy. They don't know it.
Yes.
And remember what, we want to talk a little bit about the fundamental documents of
Yeah.
Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as a work statement.
Yes. Skunk and our company have had a relationship for a number of years, quite a long time. And he had suggested not too long after 9/11 that we look at the founding documents and from that extract what is the work statement, if you will, for the United States. It's been a long time since I've looked at it, and it was done for a different purpose, but there were 4 clusters of ideas that came out of those founding documents. It's the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the preamble to the Constitution. Those 4 clusters. The first one is justice. That one surprised us. We did not expect justice to be the dominant value that was embedded in those 3 founding documents. And it's very specific about what justice means. The second cluster was freedom. And again, very specific about what those freedoms are. It's not freedom to do anything you want. It's very specific freedoms. The third cluster was peace. And that was an aspiration for the level of security and stability that was desired for the population here, for Americans, for the new nation. And the fourth one was duty. And that is, you have a duty to uphold these principles, a duty to protect these. Yeah, a duty and an obligation. So those were the 4 concepts that came out of the founding documents. What marketers do when they lose their way or when they find themselves floundering is they go back to revisit what were they and what did they stand for when they were at their best. There's reason for us to go back and look at these principles. And then what marketers do is they don't just take what they had done before, they bring it into the contemporary and revisit those concepts and make it appropriate for today. Tide, for example, introduced in 1946, best way to clean your clothes. Some years later, with competition, they lost their way. They were talking about scents and flavors and colors and all sorts of things that didn't have anything to do with cleaning. Market share was dropping. They revisited their heritage. They came back, whiter whites, brighter colors, and their market share started going up again. So that's another one of the lessons. How do you solve that kind of a problem that we can learn from the commercial world?
I actually wanted to go back to the first question, in that I would disagree that strategic communication is a preliminary phase to something. I think it definitely has to be. You can't do it by itself, but it should be integrated policy. But I would also carry it forward in saying into the moment when you're in conflict. I mean, so certainly the Russian doctrine is that strategic communications is part of combined arms warfare. And if you look at what they did in Ukraine, especially Crimea, and if you look at what they learned from the way they drew lessons from what happened in Georgia and then applied them to Crimea, it's very clear that they want strategic communications integrated into how they went off and actually fought. So to think strategic communications is something that ends when the shooting starts, it is probably not true. Now, should that all be under the same person, or should you split it up and say, well, 2 different groups have to be able to speak this language and reason this way? maybe that's a fair statement because there are different things falling into the same heading. But I wouldn't want to leave it as just a pre-conflict phase.
It's a significant part of an operational campaign.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a great point, because if you look at one of the things that I mentioned at the outset, the Russian plans to deploy nuclear capable cruise missiles in short range. Their reasoning there is they want a strategic messaging lever during a conflict to do what they're going to call, and one of the ways we approach nuclear warfare was escalate to de-escalate. So they wanted to send a strategic message of dropping a few tactical nuclear weapons to hopefully escalate things to where everybody would back down. So there's a message they're sending now about sending a message in the middle of a conflict to try to change behaviors and change actions and things. So
What happened the last time they did that, when they deployed the SS-20? What did the US do? They deployed the Pershing II. So now this is deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say. What is the United States looking at that now? Are they looking at a solution that worked before? I'm not seeing it. Are you? Is anybody?
I've seen no discussions of intermediate range or tactical nuclear weapons, thankfully, I think. But
We did abrogate the treaty, though.
we did abrogate the treaty.
So a
there's
point to
that.
that, no, so
Go
a
ahead.
point to that end, sorry, just going back to what Jody said about what happened to the shared values campaign. Are we in an environment where we could even, if we wanted to, have somebody in charge of that strategic messaging? And would it reconcile with the political environment we're in and the challenges we're facing as a society? Could we even get there?
I posit that our country has become so tribalized that a strategic messaging that encompasses the desires and the feelings of all the different tribes is almost impossible to accomplish unless we go back to getting everybody to agree to the founding document.
And the way, part of what would have to happen is it could not be tied to a specific administration because of the perception that it would be political. So if there is a way, and probably the way that a marketer would approach it, is to go to the American public and maybe in a survey instrument or in some way be able to get Americans to agree on what do we mean by the concept of justice? What does justice mean in today's society? And I suspect that we could get agreement on what it means, what justice is. We would have a horrible fight about how do you achieve it and who already has it and who doesn't. And so that's where the fighting comes from. But if we could get agreement on the concepts, then at least we've got something that we can start talking about. And we've got something that can serve as a compass in our international relations that will help us have a level of consistency that sometimes I'm not sure we have. We don't know what's guiding our decisions, as we're not as transparent about why we're doing what we're doing as a marketer would want to be, for example.
Well, everything is justice now. Whether it is a particular group like Black Lives Matter, there's even environmental justice. This word is being used over and over to go over. We may be actually farther down this road than when we thought. The question is, how do you take advantage of that and leverage that so that everyone, as you say, sees the same definition of what justice means to them, but to them based on a overall concept and before.
So if there was a way to get the majority of Americans agreeing on concepts, and there are vehicles that can do that, if we're able to reach that level of agreement, then we've got something to work with, both internally and externally.
Well, that was a heck of a first question.
But we didn't answer it.
There you go.
No,
Where would
it reside?
I'd like to actually ask one of our brilliant interns, Carrie Reinhardt, I'd like to toss her to I almost said toss her to the wolves. No, I didn't. That's not at all what I meant. I'd like to ask you to pose a question for the panels.
Sure. So I guess much of this conversation to me has alluded to what I've kind of heard in other contexts described as an international battle between forces of autocracy and democracy. And whether, these emerging communication technologies will be a tool for, be more of a tool for either force. But I've noticed that a lot of this conversation has been very binary, talking about, the US versus China. But, I can tell you that there are so many other countries, other democratic countries that produce media that really matters to my generation. I have a lot of friends who really enjoy anime from Japan or K-pop from Korea, or even, shows produced by the BBC and other media companies or organizations. And so my question to all of you is, in what ways do you think cooperation with some of our allies will play a role in the emerging, discussion and development of how we, handle strategic communication?
Okay, I get to go.
I'm confident to say.
Yeah, yes, you're absolutely right. And in the plan stage, that's the kind of insight that you uncover. You have a target audience and take the group that you identified, that's your target audience. Where do they go for information? How do they process information? Who do they trust? So then you start realizing that's your messenger and your channel are going to come through a variety of sources or a variety of outlets, not just domestic output, not just coming out of the government, not just coming for domestic consumption and then being exported. So yeah, absolutely spot on. Yeah.
You're right on the money. As a matter of fact, Jody can speak to this. And I'm not going to be specific because I can't for non-disclosure and national security reasons, but in a couple of the war games that we've done in the past year, the idea of how do the allies come together and agree on a specific message or even a concept to message about has come up. And the good news is the emperor has a couple of pieces of clothing, but is still sort of standing there. But the good news is that that's been identified and it's not hiding, and people are actually beginning to address that specific situation. I'd say it's a problem. It's problematic, but it actually is being addressed.
It's an opportunity, a
Yes.
huge opportunity.
Rand, any comments?
Well, from my experience, I certainly wouldn't look towards the Europeans for any great ideas on strategic communication. That's for damn sure. Okay, they can put out, people create entertainment and all that is fine, but in terms of real messaging, I think they're having very severe problems. I don't think they're any better off than we are. I mean, it's easy to, the other thing is, we're putting too much emphasis on, foreign influence, where domestic influence and domestic problems, I think, are, domestically generated material is just as big a problem as foreign influence. And it's too easy to ignore that, right? It's a more uncomfortable subject, which goes towards part of the issue of why, when I said before that the attitudes here need to change, is the problem is that, the whole concept of, when people hear the word propaganda, they immediately have a negative reaction. Well, propaganda isn't necessarily a negative thing, right? I mean, you have white propaganda, you have black propaganda, you have gray propaganda. It's just about, putting out a story. So, the European attitude towards these things they're not really that much better off, at least today. I mean, if you look in the European Union, I've been on panels and had discussions with people from the strategic communications groups in the Parliament, the European Parliament. They're still basically nowhere, those guys, just like we are. So, I wouldn't be looking to them for answers. So,
I would be looking to them as a battlefield, however. And you can even go back to the Cold War and the way actually the INF debate played out in Europe. And it was actually the anti-nuclear groups in Europe that were very important on whether or not Pershing gets deployed. Look at the importance of Australia and New Zealand, and actually the difference of those two countries and how they were sort of tied into the space enterprise and how that played out. So these other countries to assume that they will simply follow along because that's what we do is probably a mistake. But to understand that they are part of the battleground and may have interests of their own and may need a different targeting strategy for both allies and adversaries is probably worthwhile to keep in mind.
But your
I think,
point,
you know,
I'm just saying your point is well taken in terms of domestic, because the strategic messaging that accompanies tribalism is that my tribe is at the moment is more important than everything else. So we understand that everybody has their priorities, but our priorities are more important now than everybody else's. And that's what causes the split.
Yeah, but the problem is that, you know, nobody seems really willing to tackle a domestic part of the problem. I mean, it becomes that the foreign influence sort of becomes almost like a type of misdirection from the problem that's in our own backyard. So, I mean, the first question is, you know, how you overcome that. There's no willingness there seems to be no willingness to take that on at all.
Common principles, but also in the plan stage, the starting point for a strategic messaging campaign is what is the problem we're trying to solve, or what is the opportunity we want to take advantage of? And then what's the desired end state looks like? How are we going to know that we succeeded? So that's going to be very different for each problem that you're trying to solve. You're going to have a different end state. Well, not all of them, but more often than not, you'll have a different end state. From that, then you can start developing which target audiences has the best opportunity for achieving that end state, what is going to be required in order to close the distance between the problem you're having and the solution, what are the barriers that you have to overcome. That's all of the thinking that has to go into that plan stage, but it's rigorous, highly disciplined thinking that has to be done subject by subject. So sometimes when we talk about communication problems, the problem is so big that I wouldn't have a clue how to tackle the problem because it's so big. But when you take a slice and you say, this is what I want to tackle today, tomorrow I'll tackle that, then you can tackle that slice and build something that's going to have the desired effect. Then while that one is going forward, you move on to the next one. Or if you have a large enough team who know what they're doing, you can be doing these things simultaneously.
But there are groups domestically that are doing exactly that, and they're doing a fine job. And what are we doing about it? Nothing.
Well, it's not part of a program. And strategic.
But that's the problem. It's not part of any program. No, it's happening.
I hope that's part of the outcome that will come from this kind of a discussion, is institutionalizing it in a way that it will become operational and not ad hoc.
If we do institutionalize it, does that reconcile with our values, going back to that values discussion as a free and open society? Like, actually, you know, and that, I mean, marketing from the US government to the United States citizens. I mean, because that's something that we're going to have to.
Marketing is not the term that I would use by any means. I'm saying use lessons that were learned by marketers. But we're talking about communication, and we do that every day. I mean, we're communicating every time we have a request for information that comes out from a government office. We're communicating something that something that allies and adversaries alike have access to. The request for a proposal, all of the news stories. So everything that is public about any of the entities that we're building or any of the capabilities that we're advancing, all of that right now is out there in the public. That's the kind of messaging that, if it's focused and if we're targeting specific issues rather than just in general, we have a better chance of getting there.
Yeah, can I just bring up one point about communicating all of the time, right? One of the lessons that we saw out of the pandemic almost 2 years ago now, right, was that we did not have the best strategic communicators on what to do in a pandemic. We had lots of plans, we had lots of people ready to operationalize them, but we didn't have many people ready and able to effectively communicate to the United States population, let alone the rest of the world. So to kind of each of your points in a different twist, right? We're not doing it very well domestically, and we can definitely be doing better. We're not doing a whole lot of the planning phases of the communication part, where we did in that one example, the pandemic example, we did a lot of planning on how we would act and what we would do and all of the case studies for pandemic response. But we didn't spend any time thinking about how we would tell the population what we needed to do. So
This is where I would actually go back though to Eris and her golden apple, in that if we say that there is some part of the US government that is not merely communicating to relay facts, and we can argue about whether facts even exist, and it's the side discussion. But if they are trying to manipulate information and manipulate perceptions to achieve an outcome on a domestic audience, that's going to probably create a lot more discord than it will solve. Now, should they come out and say, hey, there are organized efforts to manipulate your perceptions that are being done from abroad or even domestically from other actors, and here's kind of how they work. In essence, you only play defense at home. Is that sufficient? I don't know. And maybe you have to play offense abroad and defense at home. And maybe we're comfortable saying that, and maybe we're not. But doing more than defense at home, I think just opens itself up to creating, to playing into the hands of those who are trying to create distrust and discord in the United States, weaken our institutions, and drop our resolve to deal with challenges abroad.
Yeah, no, see, I disagree with that. You have to play offense even at home. Defense will never solve the problem. It's never going to work. I mean, it's like telling people, well, you know, what these guys are telling you is wrong. Okay, and then you stop dead there. No, that doesn't work. You cannot tell somebody something is wrong without telling them something to replace it with. So it isn't about countering, it's about displacing. It isn't about telling people what these guys told you is wrong. It's about telling people, here's a better idea. So, but it has to be offensive. You have to be pushing the stuff out. It's not enough. You just can't play defense. It doesn't work.
I think I would say, I think that I'll say the distinction between what you're saying, Alex, is are we in a position where we're trying to manipulate information domestically to change a message, versus what I think you're saying, which I completely agree. Americans in general will react very badly to believing that they're being manipulated by the government. A lot of them believe that they're being manipulated by the government, even without the government having a plan for it. Versus projecting true ideas and things to replace disinformation that's coming out from other sources. I'm just trying to say, we're not trying to manipulate your thought process with some false information or some twisted version of the truth. We're trying to ensure that you have the truth, which the true ideals and the messaging that the U.S. is trying to portray internationally, who we are, what we will do. Messages to our adversaries of, you may go this far but no further, or there will be a reaction you can count on, kinds of things.
Instead of using the word manipulate, how about use the word educate? The government is supposed to represent all the people. So every once in a while, the government may want to say, by the way, here are our core values, just so we're not trying to manipulate you. Can I ask a question? Because in the spirit of learning from our mistakes, and again, I have to be very general, but in one of, or a couple of the war games that we did this year, we had asked Catherine Chapman to adjudicate. In other words, to actually give a PK, a probability of kill. We make holes in the ground, we blow up airplanes, we sink ships. what's the PK in terms of strategic messaging? And we had asked Catherine to adjudicate that in one of the games. Now, I know that we're all under NDAs, but is there anything in general that a lesson learned from the disparateness of the allies and the US that you glean, that you use in your adjudication, that is something that would help us get to a solution?
Yeah, I think one of the things there is certainly tailoring the measure of effect to the objective. And that's one of the biggest things that came out of all of that work, but I guess also kind of general work in the space is that, and Jody touched on this a little bit in the beginning, that marketers often have a specific set of measures that they use and that can be used across different organizations. And this is something we've learned time and time again with work in the US government space that isn't in the marketing space, that every single time we have a different measure of effect. And occasionally some of them, especially maybe like measures of performance, might go across different campaigns, but almost every single time I can think of, the measure of effect had to be specific to the campaign. And very often we had to develop, what are proxy indicators of that? If we're talking about shifting attitudes and behaviors can be very difficult to observe. And so in the planning stage of a campaign, what are the different proxies for that attitude or behavior that are measurable, that we do have the data for, right? We talked a little bit about data and how much marketers have, governments often don't have the same kind of data, they may have different data, et cetera. And so kind of mapping those over, that's certainly something that is done kind of a little differently than the commercial space, but there's still a process and plan for it.
I'd like to question for the group, because we've talked around this topic of disinformation. How do we combat disinformation?
By proving that the disinformation is exactly that. And I don't mean to oversimplify, but in a lot of ways, there is usually enough evidence if presented in a lucid, cogent, and understandable manner to be able to counter that. The problem is that many of disinformation creates tribalism. It immediately begins to stimulate the response that we want to stimulate a response across a number of different areas. We want each of those people to react differently, which then means nothing. The question is, I would say part of the solution is to come up with a combined response, whether it is a shared value or specifically just be honest and forthright and specific about identifying the target of the disinformation. The roads in California are terrible. They're just awful. And you should all understand that. And you ought to move out of California to Texas. Well, if you prove that the roads in California are actually pretty good, and you back that up with data, that pretty much, in a sense, not solves your problem, but goes a long way. It's meeting it head on with the facts.
There are two ways to change an attitude and a behavior. Once an attitude is formed, one of them is to confront the attitude and prove that it's wrong, or the belief and prove that it's wrong. That takes facts, figures, it takes consistency over time. The other way to do it is, or can be done in combination, is to change the image that led to the attitude in the first place. So if the disinformation, whatever the purpose, whatever it is that it's creating, if you can either change the image of that or change the image of the side result, like you were talking about with the tribal. So there's something change the image of that tribe or change the image of another tribe that makes it more desirable. So it's a combination of that, proving that it's wrong. And like I say, that's really hard, particularly with the government, because you have so many voices. Changing the image is sometimes a little more doable. It also takes consistency, but it's something you can wrap your head around.
I would worry, Curtis, that looking for a solution may be beating your head against the wall, because a lot of disinformation only has to be out there for a very short time. So the window for it to be effective for a policy, I mean, if somebody has made a decision based on faulty information, that decision changes the world. So if you for example, the Count of Monte Cristo, he ruins Danglars by changing the perception of what was happening in the market. And so he goes and sells all his stock, loses all his money, and now that character is ruined now for the rest of the book. You can't go back and undo that. Even a few minutes later, when the messenger arrives and said, "Hey, everything was wrong. Your bonds were actually worth money," it was too late. That happened. And so how do you live with the fact that disinformation is going to be causing actors to be making decisions that are not helpful to your policy, and then correct from that? And to presume that the free flow of information is an environment in which you're acting is probably a faulty presumption. So, but definitely there's some disinformation you have to go out and counter and get rid of, but you're always playing whack-a-mole. And there's some disinformation, you just have to deal with the policy consequences and move quickly around it.
Particularly in a world where people tend to go back to their trusted source for information. So facts become.
And corrections in general move a lot slower than the first hot rumor. And just cognitive psychology tells you that. The hot rumor is vivid and it catches your attention. The correction is laborious and slow, and you might read it a couple of days later and you kind of forgot you even read it.
The disinformation is above the fold. The
Yes.
correction is on page 10.
Well, at one time,
That's a newspaper reference for.
I think to
Taking
Rand's
Tylenol
point,
will kill you.
To Rand's point, it brings about the concept of being offensive, right? Getting ahead of it. How can you be the first to produce the truth out of it versus, and define truth, I'm with you, versus some disinformation coming out and getting that. I mean, I'm not saying it's an easy feat, but that's one of the tactics that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of people who believe that whoever has the first message wins.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't always agree with that.
I don't either, but a lot of times it is true.
I know.
So that
Rand, I wanted
that kind of says that the countering disinformation is being first to the board with the message.
That's ideal.
Which means you have to have a message, which means you have to have developed a strategic plan for messaging, which means you have to have put somebody in charge of actually doing that. That's why we're here.
that's why I brought up the concept of Tylenol. At one time, the idea was if you took Tylenol, you'd be poisoned. Now, this was a product that people trusted up to a certain point, and then all of a sudden, the disinformatia was if you take this, you will get sick. A successful campaign not only undercut the disinformation, but brought the brand back and brought the trust that people had before. So it is doable.
That was a long road.
No,
Well, it's gonna, hey, this ain't easy.
yeah, it was actually very fast. Because the president or CEO of Tylenol came out the day that this happened, or the day that the news hit, came out and said, you are customers are our most valued. We're going to pull our products off the shelf. They created the safety seal. When they went back on the shelves, sales went up. So it's combination messaging and actions. And that action alone would not have been able to, I mean, messaging alone would not have been able to do that, but message and action did.
Policy and a technology
Yes.
solution at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, another important aspect to the problem is that of, being reactive versus being proactive. So, I mean, the problem is that the way I hear people most of the time talk about these things, it's in response, they say, oh, we need to message in response to something. But the idea is that if you need to be continually working the environment and modifying and influencing the environment so that becomes receptive to the messages that you ultimately want to give. So this is a continual process. I mean, there was a great incident, even in 2009 in Iraq, where there was a case where one of our special forces units engaged with a group called Jaish al-Mahdi in Iraq, and they killed 20 of those guys, and they captured 20 of those guys, and they freed a hostage. They destroyed a big weapons cache. Everything looked great, right? And they got back to their base. By the time they got back to their base, those guys had come back, picked up the bodies of their dead comrades, arranged them on prayer mats, and made it look like somebody had come in and killed them in the middle of prayer, and posted messages. They pushed the stuff out onto the internet. All of that happened before our guys got back to the base. 45 minutes. 45 minutes, right? So the question is, how is it that they were able to take such an action in such a small amount of time? And the reason, and the answer, well, and when our guys got back to the base, it was already too late. The stuff was already out there. And it took the Army like almost 3 days to try to post forget it, 3 days, and that's just, that space is like, may as well have been infinite time. It was useless. The question is, how can those guys be able to react so fast? And the answer is because they're continuously working the environment, and they do not view these operations as point operations. They're not an operation that has a planning stage, an action stage, a middle stage, and a well-defined end, and an after action report. They don't think like that. They think of these things as a continuum. There's no beginning and there's no end. Events happen, things come up, they take actions. But the point is, they're continuously working the environment, continuously, so that the environment is receptive to the messaging that they want to put out when the occasion arises. So, that's so that's
the same strategy.
so that kind of continuous, that kind of continuous action is also needed, right? It isn't just somebody planning specific campaigns against a specific action.
We have a question. We have a question off the board.
Yes, from the Honorable Al Shaper, one of our Regents, Board of Regents members also. And I guess, Rand, you may have touched on this in the chat because you put it there, but would like to provide this to the rest of the panel too. And he asks, isn't ambiguity a powerful tool in strategic communications? And he says, I've watched the US draw red lines, then back down.
I think that's a great question. And it's great because ambiguity means different things in different cultures. In some cases, you want to be very, very clear, but being clear can be counterproductive. Truman Atchison thought he was being very clear when he was saying where US interests lay, but he left South Korea and that border out of his discussion. And shortly thereafter, the North Koreans took that as invitation to go off and attack South Korea. That was a mistake, but it was a mistake because we tried to be very, very clear. I think Saddam Hussein thought he was being very, very clear, asking if it was okay to annex Kuwait in 1991. There were some people who weren't even aware he was sending a message. And again, we have a debate or discussion of whether or not there was a message intended to be received and whether or not it was received or not. But clarity can sometimes, shoot you in the foot. But at the same time, ambiguity in certain cultures can be seen as fecklessness, and fecklessness is weakness, and then you can go off and end up in situations where you didn't want to provide the invitation to go off and get into that situation. So I think the answer to ambiguity is culturally dependent, and that goes back to understanding who it is you want to address and how they think and how it's perceived in their filters, not how Americans would perceive it in our filters.
But it
also has to be on purpose. It can't be just random. I mean, when I think when the U.S. government draws red lines, and I think it's more random. It's not. I don't think it's purposeful ambiguity. I don't know, but it just seems like it's more random than anything else. And being random is not going to be effective.
Well, and it further challenges the discussion we were having earlier, right? Is how do you get to, if you're working with allies and partners, how do you get to, a strategic message, and even if one of them might be ambiguity? I mean, when you talk about cultural differences, I mean, that could be a very difficult place to get.
And the Russians have perfected ambiguity. What they do, and it's very straight ahead, is instead of accusing somebody of something, they ask a question. Is this person really have your best interests at heart? Studies show, experts have opined they ask a question, and as soon as you ask a question, you create ambiguity, and then you can manipulate it from there. It's absolutely part of the playbook, and it's a huge part of the playbook.
You know, it's like I know a guy who was a student at Oxford. He studied. He's an English guy, and he studied mathematics at Oxford. And I said, "Well, how was it that to apply to graduate school?" He says, "Oh, well, you don't apply to graduate school at Oxford." I said, "Oh, really? Well, how does it work?" He says, "Well, your tutor invites you around one day for sherry, and he kind of just drops in the conversation and asks you, 'Are you planning to return?'" So there's no invitation. There's no nothing. It's just, "Are you planning to?" Very sort of, in an ambiguous, offhand way. So yeah, even in that kind of a situation, you can use ambiguity.
You create if you ask the question correctly, you seed the question with the data that you want your target to assimilate, and then they use that data to form their opinion based on what you've seeded them. It works every time.
But you are describing it as part of the strategy, though.
Yes.
Right?
Pardon?
Ambiguity on purpose as part of a strategy is different than because
Yes.
you don't have one.
Let people form their own opinion. Very helpful.
But in order, by the way, for that to be effective and to work, you have to have a real good feeling for your opponent, for the person you're communicating to, because you have to come up with an estimate of what they're likely to do with the ambiguous space that you've provided them. So that's going back to something earlier that was said about knowing your opponent. You really have to understand who you're dealing with and how they think in order for this to work. And by the way, you can also do things physically to send an ambiguous message. For example, troop movements. Just move things or moving assets physically around. Okay, you're not. What's the message that you're sending? And you can do that in a calculated way to say, okay, well, I'm guessing, I believe that my opponent, if I move this ship from here to there, my opponent's going to interpret it this way, or maybe they're going to interpret it that way. So I have to make a guess. But even that kind of physical movement is a kind of communication.
Like what's happening on the border of Ukraine right now.
Yes, sure.
There's also one from Zach Lemnios, and he asks, what strategic messages are not getting out that define the United States and the values of our nation? We talked about, being an open book, but what's not getting out there?
The basic tenets of the work.
Yeah, we very seldom, I believe, I'm kind of reluctant to make a general statement here because I haven't seen everything, but my sense is that we don't use principles, or we don't use values, or we don't explain why we're doing something other than tactics or a relationship with an adversary. We don't talk about what is driving our decision to take action or what is driving our decision to not take action. And I don't know, those of you who have more knowledgeable in that, you might have a better feel for when we release domestic communications or to an international audience, how deep do we go? How much do our leaders talk about or explain the values or the principles that are driving their decisions and choices? Are you aware of contemporary examples? Historically, I can think of examples, but I can't come up with contemporary examples.
Well, every once in a while, somebody comes up with the idea that there's commonality. In other words, France after the revolution was based on, liberty, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, people sometimes say that the modern cradle of modern democracy would be France. British the same way, even though the Queen technically can have your head chopped off anytime she wants to. There was the Magna Carta, and much of what's grown from that has been a sense of individual freedom and a democratic process. And I have heard people, when they talk about the world situation, they bring up the Western world, for instance. That is a catch-all phrase for people governments that recognize the importance and the responsibility to the individual.
Right. Is it true that our country is the only modern country that is based on ideas rather than being an autocracy or a evolution from a monarchy or the other forms of government? Is that true? Are we the only nation that was founded on ideas and concepts, and the main concept being that the government serves the people?
It's the only country that was the individual. If you look in the working documents, there's very little mention of the state, and
Yeah.
there's great mention of the individual as the
Right.
centerpiece.
Right.
I think we are the only country that has that as the centerpiece.
Republican thought,
Pardon?
Republican thought. Individual.
So did that give us an advantage in the competition of ideas when you're trying to convey a strategic message that is different and more effective perhaps than other?
I believe it was the source of our leadership. I mean, our strength and our might have a lot to do with it, but we also inspired souls. There are stories that Skunk has told about the lengths to which people will go to get copies of our founding documents because the ideas are so powerful in those documents.
That's true. I remember we went up to the Thai-Burma border with copies of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, translated into Hmong, Korean, Karennin, Wa. People came 200 miles through the jungle and risking personal danger to get these documents in their hands. It was a really special moment to see that.
Well, we take them for granted. To us, it's old. We've heard that before. So it's finding a way to revitalize the concepts and the notion that what this country is founded on and what we stand for today is something that I don't see a lot of evidence of.
Well, in this scenario, I think where some of our competitors, strategic communications, have been very successful, it's not just that they're old documents. I think a lot of people today look at them very cynically and don't believe them. And I think that's a mistake because I think you're right. They remain incredibly powerful and incredibly great statements for people and inspiration for people around the world who go to great lengths to either obtain them or to model their own documents on top of them so that they look like their constitution looks like ours very deliberately because they're trying to evoke those sentiments and everything along with that. But we probably lost that in cynicism and probably could do some counter programming to get to negate that cynicism.
Yes, but what are people supposed to think when they see, major movements within the country to sort of overturn all those basic principles? The election system is all wrong. Everything is all wrong. We're being cheated right and left by the government. Voting is rigged. I mean, so how are you supposed to get up and make a messaging? Yeah, we have basic principles and we live by them well. Do they see that things are looking really rocky? So how?
Well, but that goes back to the two ways of changing an attitude or a belief. You either confront it and prove it's wrong, and it's hard to do that with a deeply held belief, or you change the image that led to the belief in the first place. So you change the image from whatever causes the cynicism to a different image or a different belief about concepts that we stand for. So there's a way to do it. It's not easy. It takes a hell of a lot of strategic thinking, and you have to be intellectually tough to get rid of all of the things that are favorite sons sort of in the idea category, so you stay focused on what it is you want to accomplish.
You need to be adaptive along the way.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's key to any strategy or thought process.
Yeah, as conditions change, as circumstances change, you've got to be able to change on a dime.
So why don't we see people from El Salvador and Nicaragua lining up on the Iranian border? I mean, come on, folks.
It's not just the continent. It's other stuff that they want here. Yeah.
So with the
you also did need a lot of time to do that. So a lot of the cynicism and corrosion that we've seen now is stuff that was, I think, go back and read what Soviet said, but with stuff they began to undermine in the 1950s and 1960s, worked very hard. Now their disinformation campaigns outlasted the Soviet Union itself. So to expect you can turn the cynicism around in 6 months or even the duration of presidential administration is probably being optimistic. They thought,
We've got about 5 minutes. Has anybody got anything really important to say?
I'll ask if panelists want to take a minute or two to any last thoughts, takeaways, or anything else. I'm hoping that this is a discussion that we will continue.
I've got a few thoughts at the end.
Okay. Yes, sir. We'll let you go last. So we'll go
One
around.
thing I'd like to mention is the Marshall Plan, the success of the Marshall Plan after World War II, the idea to create a concept and a reality. As we said before, actually make an example. The idea was to contain communism, contain Russia. The Marshall Plan was brilliant in that it not only did the on the ground stuff of trying to create working, functioning societies based on the individual, but it gave an alternative to communism, and it worked. So it's doable.
It changed the image too. Yes.
Brand, any closing comments?
Just one last thing I would say, there needs to be a shift from short-term thinking to long-term thinking. That's really critical. Right now, everything is short-term. We want results, yesterday, but it doesn't really work like that. I mean, people have to realize that messaging in general, or, getting things out like that, this is, it's not like driving a car, you make a hard right. It's more like driving an oil tank where you got to make a huge arcs to make a turn. So, I'll give you an example. I know a guy who used to be an active measures officer in the KGB, and he defected a long time ago. But I asked him one time, I said, what do you do to justify your budgets every year? And he just laughed at me. He said, no, I don't justify my budgets every year. I never have to justify any budgets. He says, if I need money, I call up, they send me money. That's it. I said, wow, that's pretty good. He said, yeah. And he told me that the thing that really allowed him to do was to think long-term, because he didn't have to justify his existence on an annual basis. So he told me he could plan an operation that lasted 15 years, and he could actually had a hope to think that he could carry it through. So long-term thinking, really critical.
Or of Chinese philosophy, right on the money.
Yeah.
So I'll close on 2 comments on the Marshall Plan, because I think it's a good place to sort of end. It was so attractive that the Czechs wanted to join, and the Soviets actually ended up throwing the Czech prime minister out the window and then effecting a coup in Czechoslovakia, which sort of let us know that we were in a different kind of world. And our response to that was
That's the metric.
rigging and our response was the CIA rigged the Italian election of 1948 to ensure the communists stayed out of power in Italy, and set up the Christian Democrats to go off and lead Italy for the next 45 years. So information campaigns tie into everything else more broadly, and that's how we should think of them.
Great.
Every time we open our mouths to speak, anybody in the government, we're all doing strategic messaging. Everything that we've been doing around this table today is strategic messaging. So to think about it as, it only has to be a campaign is too limiting. But if we're all doing strategic messaging without having an overall strategic objective to what our nation stands for, having a strategic communication strategy and objective, then we're just ad hocing it. We're spitting in the wind because we don't have the strength of numbers. If we're coordinated and we're all communicating the same concepts, then we have power beyond belief.
That e pluribus unum.
Yeah.
I think we need to remind America that we're still a pretty great country. We've done more good for more people, more countries, more everything than anybody else in history ever. We made some mistakes, and that's because we do a lot. And it's a damn fool guy doesn't hit his thumb with a hammer once in a while. But we've done an awful lot of good. We're a pretty great country, and we need to remind everybody of that. And these ideas about freedom and looking at the Constitution, all that, that's perfect. We got to bring that up. We got to re-emphasize that to the American people, both young and old alike. Our nation really, as a goal, we want to survive as a nation, and we want to flourish. That's what we're all about. And I think that we have to have an overall intent. Above all, we have to have a clear understanding of the threat. So one of the first things we have to do is really define, articulate the threat properly. And that's a very tough job, because this is a very challenging time, and it's a very challenging subject. We have to do that. We have to have a communication strategy and an overall strategy. And as I said before, it has to be adapted. And we have to convince the American people that this is important, and that we have to take action. In my humble experience, the American people normally get it right when they get the facts. And we need to make sure that they get the real facts in this case, and they'll come up with the right decisions. The American people are pretty darn good for all the right reasons. And so we need to go back and, I think, stress some of these basics, some of these fundamentals. I think that the end state is very important. What you want to have it look like at the end is critical. And this has to be clearly understood by the majority of the American people. And when I say the American people, I want to include the allies. You want to include all your allies, because they have many of the same principles that we adhere to. Secondly, we're always looking around for trying to make more allies and friends. That's a good idea in any situation, at any time. Don't make any more enemies than you already have. There's also, we need to know the enemy. We need to know what this is all about. We don't really understand China as a nation. We all talk about the threat, and it goes on and on and on and on, and the missiles. We have very few people who really understand the history of China, what happened, how it came about, what the Opium Wars were all about, how some of the mistreatments of other countries to China a couple of centuries ago didn't help at all, and they have long memories too. But the Chinese also have big problems, big problems, big problems with the people and the like. They have a lot of vulnerabilities, and we never even talk about that. So we need to get our act together, really come up with a long-range plan that has all the 3 or 4 things that you mentioned in it and the like, and get on with it. So this paper that we're developing is not going to be easy, and all that.
I totally agree.
And we have to get the threat right. And you all, when you introduced yourselves, you made sure that we understood how much background you have. So let's see you prove it.
All right. I just want to say thank you to all our panelists, really very much for the discussion today, and to help this global competition project elevate issues like this so we can address them in a real way. Thank you to staff also, and to the Institute's leadership for supporting it. So be on the lookout, please, for the next event, which is tentatively planned for January 18th. And we're going to focus on how education impacts our competitive posture, especially through the lens of 20 to 30-something-year-olds. So
the idea is win this battle without war.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who joined us online and in person today. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.
Okay. Bye.